Hi, welcome back. Today we are going to be doing a lecture that is sort of the culmination of this course, in my opinion. It's going to be in 3 parts. This is the first part, and it is going to be, this part is the sort of only part that has to do with the final, very extremely optional assignment. But, so we're going to start today by asking a question, a big question. What is gender? And we're going to explore that from the perspective of modern biology, and also, which will also necessitate going into a couple different other fields, such as sociological and psychological and philosophical modes of analysis of this question. So the answer is actually, and we're going to have to go into those other fields because the answer is actually fairly complicated, and also involves, frankly, a lot less biology than a lot of people think. This is directly in response to phrases such as, "Oh, everyone knows it's third grade biology, right? That XX is female and XY is male," and you know that may well be a fair approximation for third grade biology, but we're not in third grade anymore, and biology's moved on. Biology, we've been saying all semester that the more we learn about stuff, the more complicated it gets. Therefore, this lecture is going to apply our knowledge of biology in order to determine exactly how it does and how it does not relate to sex and gender. So, how do I get a gender? I would like a gender, please. How do I get one? Well, it's actually fairly simple. When you're born, a doctor or somebody makes a judgment based on your external morphology, right? Whether or not there is a penis or a vagina, or if there is something else, or if there's something else going on. Because it's not always one or the other. There can be both. There are many states of being in which people exist in. Now, the gender, right? When we say gender, we're not always exclusively referring to what genitals somebody has. We are often referring to things like the way that people behave. There's a lot, because English is somewhat of a muddy language, there's a lot tied up in that word gender. Because of this, we actually, what we call gender is actually something called a social construct, right? So we always like to do definitions. I always like to do definitions for my lectures. It's important that we all have the same lexicon in order to discuss these sorts of things. So a social construct is an idea that has been created and accepted by people in a society. This isn't to say that they're not real, right? Mondays suck, but there is no difference in terms of, right? So the days of the week are social construct. Mondays are awful. Saturdays are great. There is no, when the sun rises on Monday morning, there is no Monday particle. There's no inherent mundaneness to Monday. It is just another revolution of the earth that brings the sun up in the sky. Like I said, there's no Monday particle that makes us all gloomy. It's because of everything that we associate with Mondays, right? Saturdays, great. Although who knows what day it is now? It's impossible to know. But generally, right? Saturdays, great. If you have a normal work week, right? You get time off. Maybe you get to sleep in. There's a lot like Saturdays. I don't care, right? Just because I understand that these are a social construct, you cannot tell me that Saturday is a hell of a lot better than Mondays, because Mondays are awful. There's a lot of other things that are social constructs, right? In many ways, money is, right? There's no, these are just little pieces of paper that we hand each other, and we have decided they have value. Pointing is another great example of a social construct, right? Sometimes athletes point when they're real happy. They do a good throw, and they did well, and they're like, yeah, they're pointing. I'm pointing now. You can't see it. But sometimes we point with a different finger, and that's bad, right? Let's take this off the screen for you. But there is no inherent badness that is contained within the middle finger, right? There is no it is only because it is a symbol that we accept within our society. Like, hey, you do that when you're pissed off at someone, right? You do it for any reason, right? Whereas pointing to the sky, right, that's a celebration. There is no biological necessity that it is not deterministic that the middle finger was always going to be the angry finger, right? It's there's no reason the middle finger is the angriest finger, right? And the pinky is we never point with the pinky. The reason behind the angry finger is entirely social. So now we have our definition of a social construct. Let's move back to let's reframe back to gender, right? So what it means to be a man or a woman, specifically more what society expects from men and women, has changed drastically over time, right? Women used to be the sexual initiators in relationship, and men were supposed to stand stoically and heroically resist the advances of women who just could not control themselves, which has there's a whole lot wrapped up in that sentence. But in addition, even though the presence or absence of a penis or vagina was used to, let's say the presence of a penis was used to assign someone male as a male when they were born, that does not mean that if, let's say someone gets in a terrible motorcycle accident or something and they lose the penis, that does not mean they are no longer a male, right? Just because it is the thing that we use to diagnose maleness at birth, or to assign maleness at birth, is not, it's not inextricably tied to the presence of genitals. So hopefully I've sort of sold you on the idea that gender is a social construct, right? Like, women used to not be able to wear pants. Turns out women can wear pants fine. The world has not exploded, right, because of pants. It's exploding for entirely different reasons. So because it is purely social, right, there's nothing that actually stops someone from deciding that the gender that somebody else assigned them at birth is incorrect. Or rather, is there anything that, and my spoilers, my point here is going to be that no, and we're hopefully, I don't know, go through this methodically and hopefully convince some people. But this is, right, because it is, gender is the only thing about you that, right, that was assigned at birth by somebody else that society largely has decided is unchangeable, right? If you don't like your name, you can just call yourself something else. You can legally change your name. If you don't like, your hair color, you can dye it. There's loads of things about yourself that were assigned to you when you were born. And you don't like your first name, don't like your last name. Gender is not so different from these, and we'll look at why. First, I want to talk about biological sex. Because I recognize someone maybe sitting there thinking, okay, yeah, gender, sure, but like sex is something you can't change. And we will circle back around to this in a bit. But many people, including people who sort of accept that gender is socially constructed, right? People who would agree with me already, many people may sort of say, oh, yeah, but like on top of that, yeah, but biological sex, that's not something you can change. And I will... we will come back to this, but I would like to say that this is also not true. Biological sex is something that is mutable and is also itself in some ways constructed. So in response to sort of advances advances in sociological thought and changing society, there has been a push, right, to define gender strictly in terms of external morphology or biological sex, right? But like we discussed with the sort of accident, right? If a woman has a hysterectomy, or if someone has a hysterectomy, I should say, that is not the that does not make them no longer a woman, because the presence or absence of a uterus is not definitional to womanhood. So because of this, and because of the motorcycle accident argument, like they're like, okay, yeah, but the penis was there at some point, even though it was lost. So like, what's something further deep inside, right? The logical progression from this is to define biological sex through chromosomes. Now, this itself is somewhat is not a surprising turn. When people in a dominant position, right, people who adhere to this strict gender binary tend to be the people who are largely in power, and then the countercultural elements are not in power, or otherwise they would be the dominant culture. So whenever people in a dominant position sort of get nervous about the security of their dominance, they like to anchor it, to make it something other than a convention among people, and instead rooted in nature, right? Something that isn't going to change. If you were born with a penis, you were a man, and nothing you can do will change that. It is a fact of nature. But again, this is where biology comes in, right? Now they're talking about chromosomes, and this is where I can sort of burst through the wall Kool-Aid Man style and say, biology, let's go. Let's talk about what the biology actually says, right? If the argument has gotten to XX is definitionally female and XY is definitionally male, let's look at whether or not the data pans that, or whether or not the data agrees with that, whether or not it pans out from the data. So what does biology have to say? Well, I'll get to this right up front. Modern biology rejects the concept of a gender binary. Flat out. There's gender binary being the concept of there exists in life two states of being for humans, male and female. The gender binary is effectively a model, right? It's a model that we use to talk about how humans develop, exist and develop, right? In the same way that 3 strikes and you're out is a model of how baseball works, but it's not actually true all the time. You can actually strike out and still get on base if the catcher drops the ball, or if it gets behind the catcher. If you run to first base before the ball gets there, you have struck out and you are on base. 3 strikes and you're out is a model of how baseball works, but it's true a lot of the time. But it is not a perfect representation of how baseball actually functions. If we were trying to model weather patterns, right, and our model was always saying, it's going to be great and sunny tomorrow, and it's just rainy and shit, right? If that model, right, if that series of equations that we were using to model the weather, if we were all meteorologists, if that model was always wrong, if it was always saying sunny and we were always getting rainy, every time it says sunny we get rain, what would we do with that model? Well, we would clearly throw that model away, right, because it's not working, or we would revise it. The gender binary is a flawed model, right? It is not a complete view of how humanity exists. Our primary example here is intersex people. Intersex people themselves, by their existence, and I want to be clear that they are not sort of, intersex people are genuine, they are real people, they are not something to be used as tools in an argument, but their existence, or to solely be sort of exist as tools in an argument, but that their existence supports the position of modern biology that, or rather modern biology supports them, and therefore the inadequacies of the gender binary as a complete model of human development. So in a science, when the model doesn't account for something, we update the model, right? And again, things are always more complicated the more we learn about them. Now, I want to head off some questions at the past here before, or some comments that I have received in the past, which is fine. I understand where they're coming from. But the common rebuttal to this, to the argument of intersex people is, of intersex people sort of disproving the gender binary as a model, as a whole model of human existence, is, well, but intersex people are errors, they're abnormalities, they're sort of mistakes, and like, hey, that's a real fucked up thing to say about a human, right? That's a person you're talking about. And also, let's go back and do what we always like to do, is sort of examine what the assumptions here are. The assumption behind this statement is there are so few intersex people that they can be written off as some sort of fluke. Now, because, and it turns out that is not true, right? If we go and we look at the data, because the gender binary or because the gender is a spectrum, right? Because we have, let's say we put on one end, we put male, and we put on the other end, we put female. There are, right, and we have like the most male you can be over here, right? There are people who exist in this gulf between these two poles that we've sort of artificially labeled, that we've decided are the two ends of human existence, right? The two extremes of human existence, male and female. There are people that exist all through this, right? Usually when people say intersex, when people hear intersex, they think of true hermaphrodism. That is having both sets of genitals, and that is uncommon. But there are many, many other types of forms of sexual development which are not true hermaphrodism. There are things like Turner syndrome, Klinefelter syndrome. All of these, they all get termed syndromes because medicine is weird, and they call it disorders of sexual development, which I'm not a super huge fan of calling it disorder, but because it is a spectrum here, we have to artificially, right? Remember, this is all a social construct. And because it's a social construct, there's no biological line that says this is where female stops and intersex begins, right? We can draw this line at any number of places, and we can always, there are always arguments to be made about drawing it in one place or the other. So depending on how broadly or how narrowly, right, if we take an inclusive inclusive definition of what intersex is, intersex people make up about 1.7% of the human population. If we take a more narrow definition, they make up 0.4% of the population. And sure, like, what's this mean? Can I put these numbers in context? Well, 2% of the population has red hair. If you know someone with red hair, you may probably know someone who is intersex. If you know a couple people with red hair, you almost certainly know someone who is intersex, regardless of if they know it themselves, right? There's a great story in a piece published in Nature called Sex Redefined that talks about a man in his 70s goes in for a hernia operation. Pretty normal thing if you're that age. And he goes in and they open him up, do the surgery, and they're like, whoops, they just found a uterus in this dude. This man has grandchildren. And he learned in his 70s that he was intersex. We could go our entire lives and not know that we're intersex. So, which is also where these sort of broad numbers come from, right? 0.4 to 1.7%, is because a lot of these things are not apparent from the outside. Some of them are not. Most of the diagnosing of intersex people comes at, or most of the identification of intersex people comes at birth. And because these are things to do with the reproductive organs, which change dramatically during puberty, they are not always reported, right? They're not always sort of counted. So maybe this 1.7% is just maybe someone's sitting there thinking this 1.7% is just ludicrously inclusive. It includes, I don't know, maybe it includes low sperm count, which isn't like the pinnacle of maleness, which it does not. But like, right, we could say that, is someone that is infertile, is that truly complete male, right? Is that all the way here, or is that slightly towards, right? Is it genitals that don't function the way that we would say they are supposed to? Is that the peak of, is all that all the way on one end of the spectrum, or is that somewhere slightly close to the middle? That's not what's happening with the 1.7% still includes, or there's still plenty of people that are counted as male under this number who are not sort of prototypical platonic ideals of men. So what about our narrow definition, right? What if we looked at a smaller percentage of people? Well, at its most strict definition, at the most narrowly defined, intersex people make up about 0.4% of the U.S. population. Well, to put this in context, 0.3% of the U.S. population is active duty military. So again, if you know someone who is active duty military, you probably know, or if you know a couple people who are active duty military, you almost certainly know someone who is intersex, whether or not they know it themselves. And 0.4% of the U.S. population, right? This is with 300 million people, that's like 1 million people, right? That's like 1.5 million people-ish. 1 million people is not a number that I am willing to write off as some sort of error or mistake. Furthermore, this also ignores people who are what we call a genetic mosaic, right? So genetic mosaicism is when not all the cells in an individual have the same genetic information. Sometimes you can have people who have, so Turner syndrome is when it is monosomy X, if you remember from, so the monosomy X is when you do not have a second sex chromosome. You only have one single X chromosome. There are some people who will have an X and a Y, or an X and another X in some of their cells, but in some other percentage they are just some other percentage of the cells are monosomy X. This also ignores things. This also does not include something like micromosaicism. So if someone is at a child, sometimes the stem cells can cross the placental barrier, and those cells can just sort of circulate in the blood very happily. We found them up to 27 years later. Right. So if someone who was female had a boy child, they could still have cells in their body circulating in their blood which have a Y chromosome. This isn't included in these numbers, of course. That is something called micromosaicism. It's a very small percentage of cells. It's just an interesting fact. So here we have, right, if we're talking about genetic mosaics, here we have a report from 2009 of a woman. She was born as a woman. She was assigned female at birth. She grew up as a woman. She has lived her entire life as a woman and became pregnant without medical intervention. That is, for many people, definitionally woman. But she has a Y chromosome. She has 46XY, 46 of the typical number of chromosomes, and she, instead of having XX, has XY. This is someone who a karyotype, a sort of ordered display of the chromosomes, right? If you were just to look at the chromosomes, say, this is, if we were to be sticking with third grade biology, this is a man, right? It's a man who's lived her whole life as a woman and got pregnant and delivered a child. This doesn't fit within the model, within the chromosome reductionist model of gender. So, there's another, why does this matter? So, in a memo from sent from the government in 2018, decided that and this isn't legislation, this is just the executive branch saying this is how things will run, which is their prerogative, but the agency proposed the definition that sex would be defined as either male or female, unchangeable, and determined by the genitals someone is born with. So this person is a man according to this the functioning definition of gender that the government is using. That is, it does not represent the totality of human existence. And here's the other thing, right? What is your personal genetic makeup? I don't know what mine is, right? Your gender was assigned to you at birth based on an educated guess, based on your external morphology. For a lot of people, myself included, this works out to be accurate. But we always want to be more specific. We always want to be, if we can be more specific with our language and more specific with our actions, that's always going to be better. You do not know what your chromosomes are without a karyotype. I do not know that I have a Y chromosome. I have absolutely no idea. I have reason to suspect that I do, but you have no idea what chromosomes you have without a proper karyotype done. But in addition to that, we know that the genetic content, what genes there are, and also the karyotype does not tell you what genes you have, what the contents of those genes are, right? Even full genetic sequencing cannot tell you what genes are being expressed, right? We know that different cells within the body do different things because they have different patterns of gene expression, right? You could have the genes for wings, but you're not flying, right? You're not sprouting wings and flying because you're not expressing those genes, even if you do have them. You could have the genes for 8 pairs of eyes, but if you're not expressing them, it's like the genes don't exist. Beyond that, you can't know the genetics of all of your cells, because in order to determine what the chromosomes are inside of a cell, you need to destroy that cell. So if anyone wants to say, I know exactly what the genetic makeup of every single one of my cells is, that is a lie, because in order to do that, you would have to destroy every single cell in your body, which seems unwise to me, in my professional opinion. So why do we so gender is sociological. It is not a biological fact, right? There's no gene for wearing pants, right? There's no gene for wearing a dress. There's no gene for liking one color or another color. But if it's the counter argument at this point is often, okay, well, if it's not biological, right, then why does everyone in the world think that or use a two-gender system? And the answer to that is they don't. It's that's not true. But it feels like we do. It feels like we have an entire world that functions off the same system. And the answer for why this is unfortunately imperialism as well as colonialism, which is sort of the mechanics of cultural hegemony are beyond the scope of what I'm talking about here. But what we can see is that we know, if you know your history, you know that Western Europe, right, Britain, Spain, Portugal, France, these were all colonial, countries in this region, Norway to some extent as well. These people from these places ended up going to other places and bringing with them their way of life. It was exported across the globe. So the reason that we see society existing the way it is because of the material conditions that people have lived with historically. Okay, so you may be thinking, all right, well, he's been going on for 25 minutes about all this and how it's not biological, but this is actually biology class. But how does this jerk want to define gender anyway? And the answer there is, again, a little complicated, because it's largely context dependent. Because we don't always mean one thing when we talk about gender, right? We, the way that we interact with the concept of gender in our daily lives is complicated, right? Let's say I'm going to go over 4 different definitions of gender. We'll talk about the philosophical, sociological, psychological, and then finish up with re-examining a biological definition of biological sex and gender. A biological definition of sex and or gender. So the philosophical definition of gender is gender is contrast, right? That how do we express, how do we portray gender, right? How does gender function in our when we're talking about it? And this is the answer here is not always, but the prominent theory is gender as contrast. This is thanks to Simone de Beauvoir, wrote a piece called The Second Sex in 1949, and in which she said that femininity is actually defined by its relation to masculinity, that masculinity is seen as a default, and and femininity is only sort of defined as the ways in which it differs from masculinity. And this may sound like some hippy-dippy nonsense to you, perhaps, but let me ask you a question. Who is this? This is Pac-Man. It's Pac-Man. How do we know that Pac-Man is a man? Well, he's a man. It's whatever. But if we look at Miss Pac-Man, in order to be denoted as female, has been given things that demonstrate that she is female. Her existence as a female fictional character has been defined by a bow and a lipstick and like some eyelashes, and I don't know, maybe that's a dimple, I have no idea. But we see this all the time. The ways in which we define femininity is sort of, or the ways in which we define, might say, like gender neutral clothing, right? Gender neutral clothing turns out that just means t-shirts, right? If things were truly gender neutral, we would see men wearing dresses, right? It would be gender neutral, but that's not the way that people, if you go and you look for it, right? I just had a baby. people would buy me lots of like gender neutral clothing, and that was just a bunch of t-shirts and stuff, right? That's gender neutral doesn't mean a dress that men can wear. Obviously, that would be ridiculous, he says, tongue-in-cheek. So this is the philosophical definition of gender, is like, how do we as a society define or identify or represent gender? Next up would be a sociological definition of gender. This is gender as a function, right? How do we actually use gender in our day-to-day lives? Well, Judith Butler observed in that a practical sense, in her piece Gender Trouble in 1990, that gender is performative. As to say that if you act like a man, if you dress like a man, if you behave like a man, people will treat you like a man, right? This has people who are intersex, right, aren't, because of the way that society views the gender binary, they tend to, or they, in many cases, not always, I don't want to speak for intersex people, but many times people will portray themselves as either male or female, and this is why sort of gender nonconforming or non-binary people really fuck with a lot of people's sort of worldview, right? Is because they don't fall into one or the other. People don't know how to treat them. So this is sort of the in a way, if we talk about trans people, right? If you have no, there's a like, I don't want to go into like the concept of passing, but if someone behaves like a woman, dresses like a woman, speaks like a woman, right? So is what we expect women to look like and behave like in society, we will treat them as women. There is no, when we meet someone, we are not doing a karyotype on them. We are not asking them for some blood so that we can isolate some nuclei of white blood cells so that we can figure out if there's a Y chromosome or not. So in many ways, the way in which we interact with gender in our day-to-day lives is to perform it. We are, I am a man because I get treated like a man because I dress like a man and act like a man. Penultimately, there's the psychological / also somewhat philosophical representation or definition of gender, right? Which is how do you see yourself, right? That gender is actually a state of mind. You act, or I act like a man because I was raised to think like a man and act like a man. Contemporary thought, this is sort of where modern gender theory is at, is that, because it only exists as a social construct, gender is just a way of viewing yourself. QED, you act, you are a woman if you decide you are a woman. There is no biological restraint that says, well, there's no inherent woman particle that is throughout your entire being that makes you unambiguously or undeniably a woman or a man. And finally, we'll move on to our biological definition, right? Biology still has a part to play in some ways, right? There are situations, usually in a medical context, where your anatomy is going to determine the type of care you get, right? So people with uteruses have to get a yearly pap smear, yearly checkup, pap smear, right? If you have had a hysterectomy, you do not need to have a yearly checkup. That's the uterus is no longer there. You don't need to do the pap smear, right? So it would be more accurate to say people with uteruses. This includes men that have uteruses. But properly excludes women who no longer have a uterus. Right? It is not women need to have a yearly checkup, a yearly pap smear. It is people who have a uterus need to have a yearly pap smear. This is, however, not actually definitional of gender, but it's rather a descriptor of what anatomy you have. So I would say this is not a definition. This is not a biological definition of gender. Hopefully I've properly sort of deconstructed or decoupled biology from gender. But let's return to that idea of biological sex. Surely if biological sex exists, we should have a definition for it, and you're in luck. We have biological sex can be made up of, or it can be defined as the result of the culmination of 5 different things. Gonads, that's what genitals you have. What gametes you produce, if you're producing sperm or ova. The hormones that your body produces, or the hormones in your body. The chromosomes that you have, yes, play a role. As well as secondary sex characteristics. These are things such as breasts, facial hair, wider hips, wider shoulders, all these, the Adam's apple. But here's the thing. So biological sex is also changeable, right? 3 out of 5 of these, 60% of the factors that we use to define biological sex are changeable. But here's the real kicker. Biological sex is itself a social construct. There is no law of nature that says this has to be, right? That this has to be the definition of what biological sex is. This is just something that some, medical people have said, okay, this is how we will define sex. And 60% of this is changeable. Therefore, biological sex is itself changeable, but we should also recognize it's actually, right? This is like the galaxy brain meme. It's like, okay, well, the final one is biological sex is itself a social construct. In the same way that a stone, right? So a good sort of philosophy bit here is that a stone doesn't know what gravity is, but when you let go of the stone, it will fall. The same way that your cells in your body have no idea what prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase are, but they go through those steps. But those words, prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, those are just words that we have placed. Those are sort of definitions, a superstructure we have placed on top of what is actually happening, right? It's some words that we've used to describe the things that we see, but they are not doing it because that there was never always going to be something called telophase. So why does this matter? Right? Why have I talked about all this? So hopefully once we successfully decouple gender from biology, we can start to examine parts of our society that have historically been unfair and unequitable, right? Why is it that women earn less money? It's not because of some biological thing. Why do we see less women in certain fields, or more represented in other fields than men? Well, it's not due to biology. For example, right? Neither your gender nor your what genitals you have determine nor predicts what your favorite color is, what type of clothes you wear, nor how functional your pockets are. Human behavior is extraordinarily complex. There's no gene for liking pink, wearing pants, or being good at math. While DNA does code for most of your physical traits, it's more a set of instructions than a detailed diagram, right? If you look at your arms right now, you might see, or the back of your hand, you might see pores. If you were to have a big cut, right, those pores, or the hairs in which that come out of your hand, may not always grow back in exactly the right place. It's not a detailed map. It's a set of instructions. Your body is sort of procedurally created. It just knows that there should be a hair follicle every set distance, right? But there's no gene for the 5 millionth hair follicle on your body, right? We also know we know things are a lot more complicated than just what genes there are inside a cell, right? That it has to do with patterns of expression. So a lot of what people believe can actually be described as something called biological essentialism. Now, biological essentialism is a kind of complex sounding term, but what it comes down to is that the belief that biology precedes culture, that groups of people are different, have different cultures, or women behave a certain way because of their genetics, or men behave a certain way because of their genetics, that culture and personality has a basis in genetics, has some sort of innate biological basis. You'll see these all the time in your life, if you haven't sort of noticed them already, but you can see these things all the time. You may not have recognized them, but hopefully going forward you can see them. These are things like, well, I've got some examples in a slide or two, but things like, she's a natural mother, or women can't drive, or like a lot of these are stereotypes that we sort of associate with, oh well, there must be some reason for this, and again, it's not biology. These can range from the seemingly positive or benign to the deeply racist or sexist or transphobic. But they are all in some ways damaging. Just a content warning. The next slide has a whole bunch of racism and sexism on it. If that's not something understandably not something you're interested in, go ahead and jump forward a minute. So, essentialism, biological essentialism can be things like boys will be boys, or of course he's good at math, he's Asian. Or the idea that Jewish people have some sort of innate money accumulating powers, that women are just inherently irrational, or something that's a bit more sort of coded, or you need to be careful in that neighborhood because those people are just dangerous, right? You can't trust them, or that they have some sort of innate danger to them. So, and these are all, this is even some that feel like positive, that you may perceive some of those as positive, like, oh, well, being good at math. That's not, because it's not an accurate representation of people who are Asian. The idea that they are all good at math is damaging, because for people who are just, regularly competent at math, that is there can be a feeling of inadequacy there. I'm going to stop because I really don't want to try and speak for people who I do not have the experience of. But the factors that have led our society to look like they do are really only minimally impacted by biology, if at all. Let's consider the pocket. All right, you got pockets in your clothing. Let's take this as a small case study. The pocket originated in the 1600s. It actually was almost exclusively worn by women, and was actually its own separate article of clothing. Right, you can see here. This was a pocket. It was a had either drawstring, you tie it to you, and women would have loads of pockets at the time. Right, pockets for days. They would carry loads of different stuff. And this is obviously no longer the case. Things have changed since then. So what happened? Clearly there's no gene that's saying, well, I need to carry lots of stuff in little bags around with me. This is a somewhat an intentionally obvious example, but by looking at the ways in which gender roles have changed over time and decoupling that from biology, we can, people have done analysis of these types of pockets in particular, and correlated that with the society at the time, right? So if you want to be able to control people, right? If you want to be able to control women, let's say, for example, right? By limiting the amount of stuff that someone can carry around with them and making them dependent on someone else to carry things for them is a significant, is a mechanism of societal control. A similar analysis can be applied to changing gender roles around childcare and work. Women were considered to be naturally superior at childcare, a result of some inherent womanness instead of the socialization of being raised and taught these things at a young age. There's other sorts. If you're interested in pockets, there's a 99% Invisible episode, our podcast called Articles of Interest that talks about pockets. So I'm going to finish this up now by with a closing statement, which is that hopefully I've sort of demonstrated the ways in which modern thinking, both biological and otherwise, considers the question of gender. And I'm going to leave you with a final statement, which is that by demonstrating no physiological basis for a strict gender binary, Raw biology. Biology has no place in disputes over trans or intersex identities. Please join me for part 2 when I get that uploaded. I hope everyone is staying safe.